Alright, so welcome back, Clint Street Machines. It's been 3 whole weeks since I posted up video. There's been a couple reasons for that. One, we had that ice age over Christmas, so I didn't come out here at all for that. I got sick as a dog Christmas Eve, and it took 2 weeks for that to go away. So that gave us the last week that I didn't get a video out. And I just had a ton of stuff to do. And we did get a lot of stuff done on the truck. It just wasn't building stuff. It was still planning and taking advantage of those fixtures we built. So let me show you real quick what we figured out, and I'll tell you what's going on when we come back. All right, so we've gotten the tires exactly where we want them, which allowed me to measure the distance between my ball joints and the distance between my steering arms. But we got to fit the control arms and the headers in there and decide what the best place to put the frame rail is based on those two things. So that's what I'm doing right now. And that's what all these measurements are. I've got my steering arm to steering arm length of 46.5 inches. I got my ball joint to ball joint length of 43 inches. I got my rack total length is 44.5 inches. That's from here to the other end. The rack, there's 5 inches of travel, 2.5 in each direction. Not a ton. The steering arm length is 5.25 inches from the center line. Inner tie rod to inner tie rod is 24 3/4. That's the distance between the pivot here and the pivot here. And I was able to use all this, and tire to tire, I have 45.25 inches from sidewall to sidewall on my tires. So if we do the math, our total steering arm length of 46.5 inches, we subtract 24 3/4, which is the width of this rack itself from pivot point to pivot point, and we end up with 21.75 left over. So that's 21.75 inches left to go from here to the steering arm on both sides. So we divide that by 2. That'll give us 10 7/8, and that is the length of our control arm from ball joint to bushing center line in order to not have any bump steer, as long as I get these all on the same plane. If your steering arm from here to the outer tie rod end is exactly the same as the 10 7/8 we have here, that allows me to have no bump steer issues with the vehicle. And we'll get into that more as I'm actually building the stuff. We also remeasured this and did our math again, and we're going to be able to lower that engine about 1 inch to maybe even 1.5 inches. But if I want to leave a little room to put a slightly deeper oil pan on it later, I'm just going to lower it 1.25 inches basically from where it is now, which is why we haven't built our transmission dolly yet, because I need to finalize that height. Then we'll build the dolly to match it, and I keep hoping that the adapter plate will come in that we've been waiting for since May 31st. It still isn't in. But anyway, it's only 8 months. No big deal. Here's our axle center line. One of the things about this you guys might not like is that tires push forward a little more than maybe would look good normally. But since this is a drag truck with a pro streeter with big rear tires and skinny little front tires and a ridiculous engine sticking out of the hood, I actually feel like that extended wheelbase on the front will actually look pretty good. Any further forward than that, it starts looking really stupid. It's right on borderline of stupid right now, which is generally where you want your pro street vehicle to be. Borderline stupid. All right, so as the engine sits bumped up against the firewall like that, without cutting into the firewall yet, our axle center line is, it's hard to see because of the focus problem, but, but basically, it's hard to tell, but right there is basically where the front axle center line lands on the engine, which is just behind the number 3 spark plug. So a little more than half of this side of the engine is behind the line. And over here it's a little better because this cylinder head sits farther back. So this one's actually kind of right on that second spark plug hole. So I could probably live with this is what I'm trying to say. There we go. I could probably live with this as far as how far back the engine is. And the farther back I go, the more I have to worry about getting rid of firewall to make room for headers. And the last, speaking of which, and the last thing I need to worry about is I need to make sure we have enough room for our feet in there and the steering column, because as you can see, with a set of headers, that's going to get kind of tight real quick, just because we're working with 2-inch primary tubes. So started kind of mocking these up to see what they look like out of the box. We're going to have to make the primary tubes quite a bit shorter. I don't want this under the car. This is a 4.5 inch across there. It's 3.5 inches at the end of the collector, and I only have 4 inches of space under the vehicle in which to tuck all my exhaust. So I'm going to probably try to get at least this point, if not, further back in front of my firewall, just so I have more space for the exhaust under there, so I don't have to worry about any rattles or anything hanging out lower than the frame. All right, so if we tuck these inside the frame rail, we got a 2-inch frame rail, so I can put this anywhere in this area, which is a pretty big space to work with, especially because I can have it shoot out about here, and it won't really interfere with the transmission. Also, if I angle it down a little, that might help. But I'm gonna have to make these pretty tight to get them down in there, which is fine, but I also have to think about the fact that I need to hook a control arm to this thing. And I'm only 5.5, 6 inches from here to here, and I need 10. So the control arm is gonna end up being out here. So what I can do is I can move the control arm triangulated. I can have the back of the control arm straight and then make the front come up forward at an angle so that I don't encroach past about here. That way I can tuck my exhaust down into this area. The problem is that's exactly where the steering's coming through. So we got to figure that out too. All right, so we grabbed the seats out of that Hyundai we got sitting outside just to throw in here and get an idea of how much space we might have in here. Because it's a big concern moving that engine in here that the farther back we have to pull the firewall to accommodate the engine or the exhaust, the less room I have inside the truck for myself. Including my feet. But I'm looking at it now, and even if we brought the firewall back a couple of inches and brought the floor up a couple inches, I would still have room for pedals on either side of the steering column, and it would still feel nice going like I'm driving straight down the road. There's a couple of things I might do. I might move the steering column over to my right a little more towards the engine so I can sneak it in behind the headers. Really got to wait and see what ends up happening with the headers and the frame rails. Then I can finalize that. I also know I want to move this column because, as you can see, it's, and that's with it tilted. If I make the column straight, it's a little low, but that's because it's not fully bolted in. Like, that's where it would sit. Not too bad. Plus, this is going to sit a little lower when it's done. It's way high off the floor right now. And these, now I may run these seats for a little while. We'll get to that in another video. In the next one, I'll talk about the budget and how we're out of money. And some of the things I'm going to do to make sure this is still a badass truck in the future, but we can get it running for the no-name nationals now. So, yeah. So now we've got that. I've looked at this. The steering column's got to be modified. I'm going to have to shorten it. I may have to change where it comes out of the firewall. But seating position-wise, this will be fine. And I do still have room to run the kind of cage I'm thinking about running. So I think we're going to be okay in here. We've emptied our strut. I'm not going to show you me doing that because I don't want you guys to try it at home. But we let all the oil out so this thing can easily close and open. So that allows us to do some mock-up. So by flattening this thing out so I can get it to where I can make sure it's actually going to fit in here, I can now use this to go there and see about where that's going to end up, which is right about there. And I think that's going to be just fine for clearing headers because they're down here, and it's going to fit under the hood no problem, which is what I was really concerned about. And that's given us about 2.5 inches of travel. We could probably use a little more, but that should be good. All right, so as you can see, we figured a few things out. Building those fixtures really helped a lot. So by doing a mock-up on our front strut, by making it to where I could just open and close it easily, I'm able to mock it up, and we were able to determine that it will fit under the hood, which I was really worried about. And we're especially good because we got about 2.5 inches of clearance right now on the strut, 2.5 inches of travel, and the struts I bought are actually 1 inch shorter than the ones I'm using for mock-up. So that should give us like 3.5 inches of upward travel. Probably way more than we would ever need since the truck's only 4 inches off the ground. So I think we're good there. The other thing we figured out is I don't know what to do with the headers and frame rail quite yet. We do know how long our lower control arms need to be. Obviously, I can shape them any way I want and bias them to the front or the rear if I need to. For clearance purposes, we figured out that our steering rack is going to work. And all I got to really figure out now is where I want to mount my frame rails and how I want to bolt the engine. The engine itself has to be bolted to something too that's supported. So we're going to need a cross member that supports the control, one of the control arm mounting points and the engine. We'll need a second area that's supported to accommodate the second bushing on our lower control arms. I am going to have to make the lower control arms, which brings me to something real quick that we'll get into more in future videos. But I'm trying to build this truck in such a way as I can use cheap off-the-shelf parts now just to get it done, and replace them with better parts later that are off the shelf. If a lot of times when you deal with full custom cars and the guy fabricates everything, when something has a problem, you can't just go to the parts store and fix it. So I don't want that to be the case with this truck. Unfortunately, after looking at all my front suspension geometry, I'm probably not going to be able to run any off-the-shelf lower control arm, and I may or may not have to modify the steering rack. Now, I'm probably going to just go with the steering rack the way it is and just build a custom control arm. That way, it's just one component that's been customized, and you can still replace that steering rack if something goes wrong with it. And being that it's made out of Chinesium, there's a good chance that'll happen at some point. So that's where we're at. And the reason we're doing the car that way, because I'm broke. But for now, the important thing is we got to get this to the No Name Nationals. They announced it. It's going to be in September, again at the end of September. I forget the exact dates. But there's only like 250 days left or something. It's not a long time. My goal is to actually have it running and driving under its own power, even if it's not ready to make a pass. It doesn't have all the street stuff on it. Like, I don't need turn signals and a horn and, you know, that backup lights. I don't need all that stuff. Don't need a speedometer. I don't need any of that stuff just to drive it around in the pits or make a couple passes down the strip. So I'm going to focus on the things it takes to get this thing actually able to move under its own power and be safe. That's going to be my first priority. And then if we have time after that, we'll worry about making things pretty and that sort of thing. What you're going to find on this truck is I'm putting it together with all the greasy parts. I'm not cleaning rust. I'm not painting anything. If I do some paint, it's just going to be to protect the bare metal. But the reality of it is, my plan is, like I said, build it as cheap as possible. And one of the ways to do that is make sure everything works before you start spending money on powder coating and paint. So I will be driving this around in bare metal, not the body obviously, but the frame will be in bare metal. Once it's drivable, I will be testing it in bare metal. And then once I know everything works and we get through the No Name Nationals, then the truck will come apart and we'll go back in and start making things pretty and cleaning them up and finish welding and finish grinding and things like that we haven't done yet. But for now, focus, like I said, get it running, driving, get to the No Name Nationals. So anyway, that's kind of what we got going on now. It's hard to start cutting, grinding, and welding when you are still trying to figure out how everything's going to fit together. I got a couple ideas on where to place my front frame rails. I think we're going to be okay. A lot of it's going to come down to me seeing how tight I can make the headers. And if I get the headers nice and tight to the engine block like I'm planning and have the collectors pointing where I need them to underneath the floor of the car, then I know where my frame rails can go after that. And then I'll worry about steering. So steering's probably going to come last. Kind of weird, right? But I think that's going to be the easiest thing to modify. So we really are making some progress, even if it doesn't look like it. Thanks a bunch for watching. Please like, comment, subscribe, and or share. That would be very helpful. And we'll see you guys next time. Take care of yourselves until then.